Hi, everybody. My name is Nathan McDonald,
I'm Dave Bourne.
and we're here today to talk a little bit about the evolution of firearms in the 19th century. Some of probably the century that saw the most development in military weapons technology.
We'll start with the flintlock weapon here. This is the pattern 1816. Saw service in the Mexican War. And it is a flintlock weapon. So it uses the same ignition system that was used during the Revolutionary War. So there's a pan here that powder would go in. This is called the frizzen. And then there would actually be a flint. I actually have the wood flint in now, which is how we store the weapon. But a real flint would be here, strike the frizzen, create a spark that would go down, ignite the powder in the pan, throwing a spark into the breech of the gun, creating the pressure that would propel a round ball out of the muzzle. The interesting thing about this particular weapon, it is an improvement, shall we say, on the original 1795, which was the first weapon produced at American arsenals. And it is still a smoothbore weapon, so not particularly accurate outside of 100 yards. And in the arsenals, gunsmith would actually have to make each individual part by himself. So the gunsmith might actually do some things here to put his stamp, his signature, if you will, onto the gun, which was great unless it broke in the field. If it broke in the field, then it was much more difficult to repair. So that is the first in our evolutionary line of firearms.
Which that's a good thing to talk about, Dave, because that did lead to plenty of issues where these muskets are rendered unusable in the field because of damage. The barrel bands, something that seems pretty simple, the little metal rings holding the barrel on. One of those breaks, and you don't have a spare in stock, well, you're running the risk of that barrel completely pulling apart the gun when you fire. So, a man named John Hall comes to the United States gun factory of Harper's Ferry, the Armory and Arsenal, and he's developed a system of making parts, especially firearms, identically, using tools and machines to replicate the same part over and over and over again. Now, we don't have one of the rifles he designed, the Hall rifles. They're somewhat rare today. They're not really made in reproductions. But we do have the sort of follow-on to that, about 30 years later almost, the 1841 percussion rifle, sometimes called the Mississippi rifle. It was used in the Mexican War by both troops of the United States Mounted Rifles and from the 1st Mississippi Regiment, which gave it the name the Mississippi Rifles, partially thanks to the prominence of their commander, then volunteer colonel, future Confederate President, Secretary of War of the United States, Jefferson Davis. This is the first percussion weapon that the United States Armory and Arsenals produce, and as well as contractors. So if you remember from the flintlock, the flint, the sparks, this system has simplified that greatly. There is just a little cone here. We pull the hammer back. There is a little brass, looks like a top hat, that sits on top of that, and I pull the hammer back, pull the trigger, and that enclosed system creates the jet of hot air and hot flame that goes into the gunpowder charge and actually fires the musket ball down the barrel. Now that system, it's actually originally came up with for hunters. European, eventually it's a Scottish actually doctor who's a big duck hunter. He's tired of his flintlock shotgun misfiring in the field, so he decides he's going to create a way that makes it easier to operate his shotgun in the field. The military, of course, picks that up about as fast as the military does most things, which is fairly slowly. It's another piece of equipment that has to be carried around. Flints, it's just a rock. You strike it, it makes sparks. You can carry 2 or 3 of those and not have to worry about it. You're going to get a good number of shots out of them. Percussion caps, you need at least 1 for every shot. And if it's damp, or you have bad percussion caps or bad powder, it could take more than 1 percussion cap for each shot. So your logistics back end goes up massively to use these weapons. But eventually the Army decides it's worth it. Now the other thing is, about that weapon, it is a rifle. So while the 1816 is a smoothbore and has no grooving or nothing in the barrel at all, it's basically just a pipe, the 1841 and the other 2 weapons we're going to talk about in a minute, they have grooving dug into them. By machine, in this case, originally by hand with a bore where a man would slowly crank it around. And that spinning grooving is going to catch the rifle ball, or eventually a conical bullet, and it's going to give it a spin, kind of a twist. So if you've ever watched a quarterback or a football player throw a nice spiral long distance throw, it's a similar sort of idea. You're trying to give it the spin that's going to stabilize it and keep it from tumbling and go further and more accurately, closer to where you're going to go. But this isn't going to be that widely adopted, and that's going to bring us to our next weapon.
Well, let's talk about this one just briefly.
Yeah.
This one still used the round ball.
Yes,
just like this one.
Mm-hmm.
So it had to be, the rifleman actually had to patch a round ball and load it. This was 54 caliber.
Now, you see back there for patches.
Yeah. Now, as we go forward to the 1855, the United States military has decided by 1855 that they want to standardize the caliber. Notice we had a 69 caliber, we had a 54 caliber. Now we're going to standardize with 58 caliber. Some of these pattern 41s will be taken back to the armory, rebored to 58 caliber to match the pattern 1855, and they will now shoot the conical bullet.
And even on rarer circumstances, they'll take these 69 caliber weapons and they will put a sleeve inside that barrel that will also basically shrink the barrel down to 58.
Right. Yeah. So, pattern 1855 being made at both arsenals. This is the weapon that Nate will actually fire later today. It has the standard 58 caliber, and it also has a new technology. This is called the Maynard tape primer system. Anybody out there that's ever shot a cap pistol, I don't think they're around much anymore, but back in my day, they had cap pistols that had these little red caps that you would shoot in the pistol. Well, basically that red cap would fit inside this little doorway right here. And the idea was that every time you cocked the weapon, it would feed a new cap up. Now, it wasn't really all that reliable, and so many of the soldiers who are using this weapon in the field will go back to the standard percussion cap, which, as Nate mentioned, is brass or copper and filled with a small amount of fulminate of mercury inside, which when struck with a hammer creates the spark. You will also notice that this has a long-range sight on it. Again, because it is a rifle, it is capable of hitting targets at much farther distances than this weapon for sure. And the 1841 was capable of hitting long distance targets, but it still won't have that big fancy long distance sight on it.
And we've been talking about the percussion caps. Ducked off camera for a second. They're very small, as you can see. But there is the fulminated mercury, the little brass top hat, and then that goes seated on the cone like that. So from the 1855, the Army has a number of evolutions. These are both of these, the musket and the rifle musket, all have kind of the same body to them, the same sort of general shape. which is based on, as Dave mentioned, the original United States Army musket, the Model 1795, manufactured at Harper's Ferry, Springfield, and hundreds of contractors across the East Coast. But that was itself based on the earlier French Charleville, as Dave also mentioned, with a few changes, alterations over the years, but that's still the same basic body of the musket. The Army would continue using that into cartridge weapons, more of what we think of for ammunition today. There's a brass case, there is a bullet at the tip, everything is all in one piece, from the priming, the primer, to the gunpowder, to the bullet, is all inside the one case. But they still use the same basic design. Even the early ones, all they do is they take the rear end off of the barrel and they make a new, basically it pops up, it opens up, you can slide the cartridge in, press it down, pull the hammer back, and you're still using the same basic loading firing technique in the rear end of the system at least.
So you have the Allen conversion, and then you have, after that, the 4570 trapdoor. Both of those will be used in the Indian Wars after the American Civil War.
And even up through the Spanish-American War in 1898, after their armies converted to bolt-action rifles, the National Guard still takes those to Cuba and the Philippines.
Sure.
But the Army is, of course, a little bit old-fashioned. They're a little bit hesitant to adopt technologies that might not work when soldiers' lives are on the line. But between 1855, with this design, and 1886, this is how far things evolve in about 30 years. This is a bolt-action rifle. If I take my safety off, bolt comes back. There's the magazine feed. It has 10 rounds, 10 bullets that fit into that magazine. And each operation of the bolt puts a new cartridge in the barrel to fire. So no separate primer, no percussion cap, no flint, nothing. It all just keeps going as long as you have cartridges in the magazine. That is about, I'm sorry, Dave.
There is a primer.
There is, yes,
It's
you're right.
built into
No separate primer, I should have said. Yeah. There is still a primer. It's in the base of the cartridge, and it still uses impact. There is a hard really to show to the camera, but there is still a firing pin that's going to strike that primer and actually set it off, create the ignition.
Yeah.
So this weapon, it is, believe it or not, heavier than most of the original muskets. The action is pretty bulky. It's a lot of metal. The barrel's fairly heavy, and there's a lot of wood on the gun. So Samuel Paris Lee creates that action in the 1880s, shops it around. The United States Army's not interested, but the Marine Corps and the United States Navy will purchase weapons from Mr. Lee, the so-called Lee Navy rifles. And the British Army will adopt a variation of this, his Lee action with the bolt, and the Metford rifling design in Britain as their service weapon in 1886, which will be replaced by the long Lee Enfield, and then this weapon, the short Lee Enfield, short magazine Lee Enfield in 1960. That's going to be used in World War I. It's going to be used by the British Army in World War II. And the Indian Army will inherit it when India becomes a separate country. And India, Pakistan, and former British nations around the globe will continue to use the Lee Enfield up to Canada's pretty much the last country using a Lee Enfield type rifle, the number 4, when they retired 2 years ago in 2018. They replaced their Arctic Scouts are still using a Lee Enfield pattern rifle until replacing it with a homemade, or well, a domestic Canadian production rifle.
And of course, we have the, this is British, of course, the Lee Enfield, but the United States actually at Springfield Arsenal produced something very similar to this.
Mm-hmm.
The pattern 1903 Springfield is very similar to this weapon.
It is, and they're also both similar to the sort of originator and the mainstream of that idea, the Mauser action. Georg Mauser was a German inventor and arms maker in the 1870s, came up with his own bolt system. He didn't pair it with a magazine like that. And eventually it evolved into another system that was used not just by the German army, but in the 1903 Springfield, in the British modernization of this rifle, through today. Most sporting rifles use either a Mauser or a Lee Enfield type feed system.
Correct. Yeah, I'm related.
Oh, neat. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully we've kind of laid out a little bit of what evolved and what technology came through into existence in the 19th century. I've been Nathan McDonald.
I'm Dave Bourne.
And thank you for joining the Historic Preservation Division.